But I was so impressed with Jay's speech that I couldn't let Lancaster have it all and get one over on us. So I've gotten to know Jay pretty well, and I was just intrigued at what he was going to talk about. And I only knew that, like his mom and dad, Joe and Sue Paterno, he would have the ability to win the crowd over, and that he did. I've seen him do it at Thon many occasions. I've seen him do it at my family's function at Huddle Up FTK, that we started our first one back in May of 2013. Probably the most memorable that I can remember was at his dad's memorial service, that in January of 2012, the American Rotary has dubbed it as one of the most important American speeches of the 21st century. Now, the first time I met Jay was about 10 minutes before my speech at Thon on behalf of my family in 2012. And it was probably about my 100th practice alongside the stage. I was pretty amped up with adrenaline. So amped up I felt like I could lift like a truck axle when I deadlift. But all of a sudden my train of thought was broken, and I hear this familiar voice, "Hey, that's a nice shirt." And I'm like, I looked over, and there's Jay Paterno wearing a very similar Thon shirt. So a couple flash of thoughts run through my mind. Here's the son of the legendary coach. He just wowed the Thon crowd with an 8-minute speech. But what was most amazing about that, it was 1 month after his father had passed away. And all I could think was amazing courage. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. I then replied to him, "Are you talking to me?" He laughed and said, "Yeah." He said, that's a nice shirt," as he tugged on his. And all I could think to say is, "Well, I guess we have good taste." And we chatted and we laughed and introduced him to my family, and he introduced me to his children who were there with him. The one thing I remember, if I never saw him again, I thanked him for his service at Penn State and all that he and his family had done for Thon and Four Diamonds. Because if you recall, in Joe's memory, the family asked that money go to Thon and the Special Olympics. And it made a huge difference that year for Thon to break the 10 million mark. I also let him know how much I appreciated his father, not only for what he did on the football field, but through his philanthropy and building men for others. And that's what Joe Paterno did for 62 years of his life. He built men for society, better men for society. And Jay had the fortune of helping his dad do that for 17 years at Penn State. Very noble. Jay Paterno and his dad would be the first ones to say the awards and accolades and trophies and wins and losses, none of that mattered. What mattered to them was the caliber of men that left their program with a degree. That was their reward every single year. And that process worked for 45 years under Joe, and that can never be removed. The Paterno legacy of excellence was carried through during the Bill O'Brien era and is now being carried through the Coach Franklin era. And Joe Paterno's legacy is the Penn State standard. Off the field, Jay has been involved with Net for Nets, a nonprofit agency devoted to fighting malaria. He serves on the board of the Mount Nittany Conservancy. Jay has also been a columnist for StateCollege.com. He's written pieces for the Daily Collegian, USA Today, the NCAA, the Penn Stater, the Center Daily Times. His columns have been cited in Sports Illustrated, ESPN, and ESPN.com. But what I find most interesting is they've even been translated into Chinese. So didn't know there were so many Penn State fans in China, but that's cool. But one thing is, Jay is full of wisdom, and that wisdom, as many of us, is passed on from our fathers, our mothers, and our mentors. And Jay has lectured at university classes in psychology, labor and industrial relations, Penn State's College of Communications, and the Smil College of Business. He's done leadership speeches at different corporate events, Oppenheimer Funds, Highmark, just to name a few. He's also been a great supporter of one of the charities important to my family, Four Diamonds, in this area, traveling coast to coast to these different fundraising events. And finally, one of the topics today is modern day media. Jay knows a thing or two about that. He's been very visible. So I think what he has to share with us today about the Paterno family legacy and the modern day media will confirm our duty as Rotarians and his family's duty for a long, long time, and that is service above self. I am proud to introduce to you my friend, Joe Paterno.
Thank you, Shane. Please put this water down. It is up. Thank you. It is great to be here. It's great to see so many people here. 8 inches, is that about right?
Sorry, I'm short.
Please speak at least 8 inches away from the microphone. Is that okay? It is indeed great to be here. It's great to see so many people. It's great to see so many people here that are here in common cause. We live in very interesting times where so many people spend so much time trying to drive wedges between different groups, different people, over the smallest things. But when I come here and I see an organization like this, where people are engaged in their community, people believe in civic duty, service, those are the things that will make this place great, make this country great. Those are the things we stand tallest when we are bending over to help someone else up. And I really believe that. It's a hats off to all of you for being part of this organization. You guys talked about the World War II, the trip to the World War II Memorial, and the Korean War Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery. My father-in-law turned 90 on Saturday and fought in the Pacific. And the first time he went to that memorial, it was a very, very moving experience for him to see that and recall those things. And again, that's service. That's putting a smile on someone else's face, letting them know that we remember the sacrifices that they made. We live in very, very interesting times. You know, recently, so many things have happened. Airstrikes in Libya. Israel's neighbor torn apart by civil war. Open warfare between different sects in the Persian Gulf region, a commercial airliner shot down by missiles, and a president that can only respond with sanctions on Russia. Israelis and Palestinians in open warfare, Russian troops on the foreign soil of a neighboring country, American citizens being held hostage by extremist groups in the Middle East, waves of illegal immigrants coming into this country. You may think I'm talking about now. This applies to the 1980s as well. And I'm not going to get into politics, so just relax. It's not where I'm going. But the point is, the more things change, the more things stay the same. And it requires perspective. It requires knowledge. It requires things like that to understand the challenges that we face around the world and within our own country. But what I described also fits today. But we're all victims of one thing. The older we get, the better the past looks. The rough edges of our past get smoothed out by the passage of time. Believe me, when I wrote the book, I'm going to talk about it, I was recalling things, and then a lot of rough edges showed up. And I went, gee, I don't know if I can put that in print. But we're all guilty of looking back at our lives and recalling the good old days. And there's a gauzy haze that we look back and see how wonderful everything was. But the biggest difference between the era that I described and today is the way in which we get our information and our news. The 24/7 news cycle, driven by social media. It's driven by social media. It needs to feed and create news. And as a result, our national attention span has become dysfunctional. Last week, the President of the United States, regardless of how you feel about it, and I don't want to get into that because I know there are different reviews on everyone, but last week, the President of the United States had a press conference to discuss Russia and Ukraine and ISIS and the things going on. And you guys know what the biggest thing that was reported out of that news conference? A tan suit. That's what we talk about in this country. The White House press corps was outraged, insulted by the fact that he wore a tan suit. We should be outraged that that's all they talked about. That's all we heard about was a tan suit. It's a nice suit. I did one myself. It looked pretty good. But that's what we talk about. It's the horror of the White House press corps. Well, I'm sorry if they were offended. They've done a lot of things that have offended all of us over the years, too. But that's what they wrote about, they blogged about, they tweeted about. It was discussed on television. I feel dumber for having watched that. You wasted space in my brain. I wish you could delete those files from your brain. The biggest, most viewed news story in the last 24 hours was not the beheading of an American journalist. It was that celebrity nude photos were hacked from the iCloud. That's the biggest news story. To which I say, look, if you don't want nude photos to get out in the cloud, don't take the damn thing, okay? You're not going to find any of me. First of all, nobody wants to see them. Second of all, I don't take them. But the point is, that's a bigger story. That's what we talk about in this country. Oh, let's get a grip on what matters. But that is why this may be the most difficult era to be in a leadership role in this country that we have ever seen. Anyone in the public eye, government, business, philanthropy, or any number of fields, has to constantly contend with the fact that an issue can explode at any minute and any time. Often first on social media, followed by mainstream media, which is getting less and less. It's getting more and more difficult to see the blurring lines between the two mediums. I know, as many of you know, I lived through a story just like that. A story that took on a dimension and false narratives that almost 3 years later, we're still trying to unwind. The unfortunate truth right now in this country is that the for-profit media rewards being first over being right. Think about that. The journalist that shows up a day later with the right story, that bus has already left. Be first, don't be right. In the dedication page of the book that I just wrote called Paterno Legacy, I wrote this. I dedicated it to my parents first, to my wife and family. But I also wrote this. I said, this book is for journalism students. In a world where the pressure to be first often outweighs the responsibility to be right, I hope you will look inside your heart and pursue the truth. It is the most solemn responsibility of freedom of the press. Realize that your mistakes will have consequences for real people. I gave a speech to a class of journalism students at Penn State last spring, and I warned them as they go into their chosen profession to remember the words that I have learned in my life. We must never sacrifice truth at the altar of expediency. And we all like to gripe about the media. We all do. Even people in the media have griped about the media to me. Well, you know, it's the media. I'm like, you're the media. But the point is, what do we reward as a society? Expediency. The writer that posts the first story of questionable accuracy gets more web hits, and therefore his organization gets more ad revenue for that organization. That is the business model of the media that we're working on. That puts enormous pressure on them to rush stories out sooner. But as I mentioned, we are our own worst enemy. The fundamental truth is that news has become a commodity. It has become a product. It's a for-profit product that we consume. Producers of news serve us what we want and what we keep ordering. News organizations now know instantaneously what you're reading, what you're watching, what you're clicking on, how often you're clicking on, how many Facebook likes it gets, how many times it gets retweeted. They know immediately. And they react to that. A story that often starts at the bottom of the page of the website, within 45 minutes to an hour, may move to the top of that website because they know right away this story that was at the bottom, we didn't think was going to create any attention. Everybody's reading it, so let's put it up front. And a story that starts at the front, at the top of the website, they move down to read that. That's the way it works. They're only reacting to what we ask for as a society. Why does CNN spend so much time discussing the missing Malaysian airline, the first one that went missing, the Malaysian airline that disappeared over the Indian Ocean? It went on for day after day after day because for the first time CNN was looking in their rearview mirror at Fox and the ratings. They said, this is what people want. Keep covering it. Why are the news anchors spending so many days in Ferguson, Missouri? Because that's what we want to watch. That's what we're looking at. Why did they report on Kim Kardashian's latest haircuts? Because people click on it. We are our own worst enemy. In that environment, it's very tough to be a leader. It requires men and women who can weather the short-term bad news cycle and respond in ways that put the focus on the long term. General Motors just recently went through a very difficult situation where decisions that were made in engineering ended up resulting in the deaths of consumers of their people who drove their cars. The CEO of General Motors has handled that about as well as it can possibly be handled for the people that were killed and their families, as well as for her company. She addressed it immediately head on. She said, look, we're going to handle this as it relates to the victims of our mistakes. We're going to own up to it. We're going to stand up, and we're going to put together a long-term plan to make sure this doesn't happen again. She had to go in front of panels on Capitol Hill and deal with blistering questions. But she stood there, and because she did it the right way and took a long-term approach, she was able to get it done and help them move forward and help them understand that it won't happen again and change the culture within General Motors. But the people willing to do that, the people willing to admit mistakes, are few and far between. Worse yet, we demand immediate accountability without the benefit of perspective that only time and investigation can create. We are impatient. We are impatient people. We hear an audio tape of somebody saying things we object to, or we see a videotape of something that offends us, and you don't know what came before that or after that, but we want answers right away. Many of you may recall the Duke lacrosse scandal from years ago. At the end of the day, the young men who had their college careers ended, their season canceled, and their names splashed across media outlets across the country had actually not committed a crime. Sure, they did some things that I would not want my son to do. Youthful indiscretions was certainly not illegal. But by the time that story was over, the damage was total. In 2007, speaking to a law school conference, Duke President Rich Rod had said this: I'll end with the deepest lesson this case taught me. When I think back to the whole complex history of this episode, the scariest thing to me is that actual human lives were at the mercy of so much instant moral certainty before the facts had been established. If there's one lesson the world should take from Duke lacrosse case, it's the danger of prejudgment and our need to defend it. Let's defend against it at every turn. If only the leaders at Penn State had been able to heed the lessons of the Duke lacrosse scandal, the damage on the reputation of an amazing school and some very good people may never have happened. The answers to some of what ails us as a country are right here in this room. Years ago, my dad had spoken to a Rotary club, and he got a mug. And on that mug was the four-way test. I remember he pointed to it and said, you guys ought to read this. So I read it, and I was young and didn't really I didn't quite understand it. But on it, it said, of the things we say or do, is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? I think about that every once in a while. When I think about some of the events that occurred in my life. And every time I see one of these stories explode on television, I cringe. Because I know somewhere we're not getting the whole story. I know somewhere there's somebody rushing to make a deadline without all the facts. And I know when they repeat the things they get wrong over and over and over again, those falsehoods have a tendency to harden like cement. But through this, through all those things that happened to my family, my father, and more importantly, the university that I love with all my heart, I saw my dad in the toughest days of his life never waver from his core values. Never waver from what he taught all his life when things were going well. I never saw he never wavered. He got fired on the telephone. 2 days later, he's coughing up blood. And we had to sneak him out of the house to get tested at the hospital because there were 150-odd journalists across the street. In his own house, he had to go down into the garage with the garage door closed, lay down on the floor in the backseat of my sister's car, and put a blanket over him so he could get to the hospital and get some tests done. And he never bitched. He never complained. One time we were sitting there and one of my brothers and sisters complained about all the meeting people across the street. And he said, you know, don't blame them. They got a boss that puts them there. And they got a family they got to support. And they have a job to do. It's not their fault. It's our fault. It's society's fault. This is what we demand. Thanksgiving weekend that year, most of the journalists had gone home. We kind of told them, look, nothing's going to happen over the weekend. There was one guy there sitting across the street. It was cold, it was raining. And I went over and I said to him, look, why don't you go home to your family? I said, you know, my dad sent me out. I want you to go home to your family. The guy looked at me and I said, look, I promise nothing will break as a news story out of this house. And I won't tell anybody you weren't here if somebody were to ask me. And he looked at me. And I thought about my dad and his, the understanding he had for other people. Even through that difficult time, he stuck to what he believed in. And the real core of his soul, the real core of what he believed in, was excellence over success. And what he would tell us is, look, success is how other people define you. They want how much money you make, how big your house is, what kind of car you drive. All those things are seen as success. But excellence is internal. Excellence is being able to have a set of values and look yourself in the mirror at the end of the day and understand that the values you aspire to, the values that you preach, the values you tell everybody else you adhere to, that you haven't compromised. You know, I read the book John Adams by McCullough. It's a great book. And there's a quote in there from John Adams that my dad and I talked about on several occasions. And everybody in leadership would be well advised to take this quote and keep it in the back of their mind. John Adams wrote, no matter how high or low my estimation in the eyes of the world, my conscience is clear. And what he was saying, they can write about me what they want, they can say about me what they want, but at the end of the day, I did what I thought was right. At the end of the day, I did not compromise my values. And so I can look myself in the mirror, and ultimately, I can look my God in the eye when that day comes and say I did what I thought was right. And that was the inner strength that my dad had. That was the core of what he believed in excellence. And through all the difficult times, he didn't ever sit there and say, you know, Jay, this isn't fair what happened to me. In early December of 2011, I was told I had to meet with the Free Committee who were investigating all the things at Penn State. And the end of that conversation with them, I was in there for almost 2 hours. Most of the questions that they asked about were aimed right at putting the blame on Joe Paterno and the football program. I answered 3 or 4 questions in an hour and 48 minutes about the person that actually committed the crimes. Everything else was related to trying to create this idea that we were out of control. And my dad said to me, you know, Jay, he goes, have you gone and talked to those people yet? I said, yeah. He said, what do you think? I said, Dad, they're not really looking to find out how this really happened. They're really looking to blame someone. And I said, I'm telling you, Dad, sure as you're sitting here, they're going to write a report that alleges lack of institutional control, and they're going to sanction Penn State football. I didn't say sanction you. I said they're sanction Penn State football. And this sadness came over him. And he said, we can't let that happen. He said, because too many people, over too many years, did things the right way. Whether they were our student athletes, whether they were our professors who didn't give kids grades, whether they were administrators, coaches, the alumni who didn't buy players. He said, not just in football, but every sport here at Penn State. We had an athletic department that is the gold standard. We can't allow them to do it to us. It wasn't, what are they going to say about me? It was about we and us. That was the ultimate lesson that he gave me. It's never about I or me, it's we and us. To that end, I want to read to you the book. This is not a plug for the book. I just want to read with you because I think it's reads you a little bit of the prologue. So I think it kind of gets to the essence of what it's about. So when you watch someone you love slowly die from cancer, it is the changes that stay with you when they're first gone. I think of my father without his hair, his raspy voice, and silent presence on a ventilator the last 2 days of his life, communicating with nods. Now when I visit his grave, I think of him walking, running, laughing, his thick head of hair, his voice, an unmistakable guiding force in my life. I talk to him, I pray, but mostly I want to hear his voice. It happens sometimes. As I stand by his hillside grave, I hear him in a gust of wind, a rustle of leaves, the sound of geese flying overhead. Mostly I want to obliterate the wall that went up in his life on November 4th, 2011. On one side of that wall, everything good and bad in my life before that day is bathed in light. After that day, everything both good and bad is in the shadows. My life will be forever bisected by the wall and the events of that day and the days after. But in a true display of his character, in the last months of his life, my father never allowed himself to feel bitterness or hatred. In a world that wanted him to spew venom, he never allowed it to touch his soul. For over 6 decades, Joe Paterno conducted his professional life in a principled way. In 7 days, those decades were received in the background and became an object of an all-out assault in a scandal not in any way of his making. His only goal was to see the justice be carried out without regard to what it would mean to him or his football program. But Joe Paterno's life stands far taller than the events of the last months of his life. He carried himself as though Rudyard Kipling's poem, If, was encoded in his DNA. He shared that poem with me when I was young, and it has always resonated with me. No one ever walked with kings, but never lost the common touch better than he. No one ever kept his head about him, while all others were losing theirs better than he. Joe Paterno could have been anything he wanted, but he chose to settle in State College, coach football, raise a family, and teach the thousands that he coached. More than that, he had a way of explaining things and talking to you at times. Wasn't easy to understand, but he was always blunt in his assessments. Self-esteem wasn't something you were given. You earned it through achievement of worthy goals. Near the end of the prologue, I talk about some of the lessons he taught, but the beauty of Joe Paterno is enduring lessons never leave you. In his days as a father, a coach, or a mentor, there was always a lesson to impart. The lessons worked their way into your brain and subconscious. And years later, they reappear and you smile as you pass on that lesson, knowing exactly where you learned it. For nearly 62 years at Penn State, he passed along his lessons to everyone he could reach. There were no single teachable moments in his life. It was a constant stream of teaching that never required a particular moment to trigger it. The trick was to always listen to him. As the last few months of his life began to unravel, the lessons kept coming. The week after he died, we became aware of how far his lessons had reached. As tens of thousands of people filed past his casket and paid respects, I listened to stories and hugged those who were crying. The visitors hailed from down the road to places in faraway lands. All had a story or a connection to this man whom many had never met or had met briefly, but all shared how his words or life example had reached them. As I get older, I listen more and more carefully to my father's stories and jokes and learn to appreciate them all. At a dinner table or in a meeting, he'd speak softly but deliberately. He'd challenge you to pay attention, maybe even lean in to hear him better. Like he was letting you in on a secret. He usually was. In February of 2011, he and I were talking about the speech President Obama had given in Tucson after Congresswoman Gabby Giffords had been shot by a mad gunman. In my bi-weekly column for StateCollege.com, I had written about it. My father liked the theme of what I had said. Jay, I admire how the president handled that speech. You know how tough that was? The event was in a basketball arena, he said, and it was part memorial service and part rally for the community, people of that community. But he had to give a speech that was upbeat but respectful. That was tough. That speech had to mourn the death of a young girl but not bring everyone in the arena down. That is so difficult. I admire what he did. Little did I know that less than a year later, I'd be standing in a basketball arena giving a speech about my father's life that had to be hopeful and respectful, but also be mournful. It was my father's lesson. The president's speech was something I thought about before writing my father's eulogy, mainly because my father had recognized the power and strength of that speech. That lesson stayed with me when I needed it most. And even now, many months after his voice is gone, his lessons continue to keep coming to me. And his work lives on. As I wrote on Twitter the morning after he died, Joe's light will never leave my life. And neither will the words he gave that guide me. This is the story of those words, and of a life example not only that survived but thrived in the onslaught against it. It forged this example in a way that made it stronger and more enduring. As 12,000 people stood and held hands at the memorial for Joe, I led them in the Lord's Prayer. I could not have known what I would learn from many people after that event, but in that moment, his life came through as I spoke the words that many have told me was a moment they may never forget. I said, for 45 years, he led this program. He always ended his post-game remarks with the same thing. He'd say, let's thank the good Lord. And we would kneel down, hold hands, and say the Lord's Prayer. One time, just out of curiosity, I said to him, Dad, why that prayer? He looked at me and he said, Jay, the words. Our Father, give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us as we forgive. We, us, every pronoun is plural, Jay. We and us. There is no I or me. Then it clicked. Here in the last act, after every football game we played, was a reminder from Joe that it was never about him or I or me. It was we and us. Unselfish to the core. The current and former players that were in the room that day, they knew that scene. They'd had those moments. And in that memorial service, I asked everyone if they were able to stand up and hold the hands of the person next to them and step into that locker room and feel the bonds of Penn State. And we said the Lord's Prayer as a team for my dad. Every time I say that prayer now, I can hear him. I stand by his grave on my visits and I say it aloud so I know he'll know I remember his lessons. I hope he smiles when he sees me. And that is what it's about. It was about we and us. There was no I or me. A lot of people, I've done dozens and dozens of interviews about the book, and I've said to them, what I want people to understand is this. This is not a book about 2 months of my dad's life. 2 months that most of them want to talk about. This is a book about the lessons of we and us. It is the lessons of excellence over success. It is the lessons of waking up every morning and either getting better or getting worse and understanding that we never stay the same. It is a lesson of service to others, education, the things that we all value. You see, it was the games my father won in his life that mattered the least. Coaching football did not define him. It was what he did. It was the medium by which he chose to create the masterpiece of his life. And that was to impact young people. That was to create better men and women at Penn State. That was to educate generations of people. That was the lesson. And when I think of that prayer, when I think of those moments I had with him, I can't help but hold on to those values and hold on to those lessons and carry them with me. And that's what I want people to get when they read this. Even now, despite all the things that have been done and all the things that may have been said about my father by people who were in administration at Penn State, decisions they made, the easy path would be to be angry and turn my back and walk away and leave. But I hear this voice that keeps telling me, stay engaged, make an impact, do things. I've continued to advocate for Penn State. I've continued to stay involved, not because I possess some selflessness of my own doing. It's because the lessons that I learned, the lessons that were the truth about the life of my father, they will not allow me to be any other way. And I hope you guys all understand that. I hope you've all gotten that from him as well. But the people in this room, the fact that you're part of this organization, and the fact that you're engaged, as I said at the start, the fact that you're doing things for others, the fact that you're bending over to lift other people up, that makes you the very same type of we and us people that my father wanted more and more of in this country. And as we face the challenges as a country, we've got to ignore the things that drive wedges between us. We have to find the common cause in our communities, in our counties, in our states, nation, in the world. We've got to be we and us people. And that's the true lesson of what I got out of my father's life. Thank you very much.